Brawl Stars Competitive Tier List, version 41. Keep in mind that this tier list is almost exclusively created with feedback from the best players in the world. In fact, 25 of them right there. Almost all of them are competing in the World Championship later this year. So if you disagree with the tier list, you can take it up with them. Kicking off the F tier, these are brawlers that are not competitive and honestly not fun to play right now. We got Doug. Doug didn't get any kind of balance changes or reworks. He's still the worst brawler in the game. And close next to him is Hank, moving from the D tier down to the F tier. He also did not get any balance changes, but more of Hank's counters are higher up in the meta, so he is even more unplayable now than in the last update. I have had a Hank quest for the past week, and every time I try and do it, it's brutal. I think I'm gonna wait for duels and just throw him in there and win without him because it's so hard. Next to the D tier brawlers, these ones are also not competitive, but they're not quite as bad as the F tier. Kicking us off, we have Grom staying in the D tier. His attacks are really easy to dodge, especially with brawlers that can move fast, and he really can't do anything against close range brawlers, at least not when they get close to him. Janet is moving from the F tier up into the D tier. She didn't really get much better. It's just that Hank and Doug are significantly worse in this meta, so she doesn't really belong in the F tier anymore, but she still sucks. Pain. Yeah. Ash is moving from the C tier down to the F tier. Another tank that did not get any changes, and he got quite a bit worse because of how the meta shifted. Bonnie is staying in the D tier. She's really struggling due to her movement speed and not having a near enough burst damage to compete with the other top brawlers in the game right now. Mr. P is staying in the D tier. No adjustments were made to Mr. P. He also does not do a lot of damage to aggro brawlers since they only take half damage from his attacks just by moving toward him, which is what they usually want to do anyway. Brock is moving from the B tier down into the D tier. He actually got a buff this update. I'm kind of shocked, okay? I did not approve these changes. The pros approved this, but apparently he's not good anymore. The buff was only to his hypercharge, and the shots are just really easy to dodge for most of the top players right now, so I guess they're just moving him lower. Okay, next we have the C tier brawlers. These brawlers are also not competitive, not for the pro players at least, against pro players, but you can still play some of them and have some fun with them, but you're probably not going to get into masters with them. Kicking us off, we got Edgar staying in the C tier. Edgar is slightly worse than before, just like other close range brawlers that didn't get any sort of balance changes, but he's still a decent counter to a particular few brawlers, especially throwers. And I still have fun playing with him in, you know, diamond ranked. Charlie is moving from the A tier down into the C tier. She has been nerfed several times since she was released, and she's finally at the point where she is weak enough that there are almost no situations where she is the best option. Chuck is moving from the B tier down into the C tier. Chuck is really only good for heist right now, and there are quite a few brawlers that can actually deal more damage to the safe than him, so he's not being used competitively quite as often. Jackie is moving from the B tier down into the C tier. She just can't keep up with other close range brawlers that have risen to the top, so there's really not much of a reason to use her right now. Miko is staying in the C tier. Miko is still really good against players that can't time his jumps just right, but he's pretty easy to deal with if you know how to do that, so he is no longer a great competitive option. BB is moving the B tier down into the C tier. She is another tank that is getting countered really hard by a lot of the top brawlers. Bull is staying in the C tier. He's actually slightly worse than before, but compared to a lot of other tanks in the game, he actually hasn't been affected very much. Rosa is moving from the B tier down into the C tier. If it isn't obvious by now, if a close range brawler did not get a buff this update, they're probably not going to be used very much, and Rosa is no exception. B is moving from the B tier down into the C tier. B has very gradually gotten worse with each update that she does not get a hypercharge, and now she's officially below average. Colt has moved from the B tier down into the C tier. Keep in mind that this tier list does not reflect SpongeBob modifiers, otherwise he might be right up at the very top. Similar to Chuck though, Colt is only really good for heist right now, and more brawlers are able to keep up with his damage output thanks to their hypercharges. Next we have Maisie staying in the C tier. Maisie kind of just lives and dies by her super, and ever since her super charge rate got nerfed, she's actually been pretty weak. El Primo is staying in the C tier, but if we were rating them by their skins, SpongeBob El Primo might be S. El Primo has always been a solid counter to other tanks and close range brawlers, but even he is being played less because of the current most played brawlers. Draco is moving from the A tier down into the C tier. Draco has been an exceptional tank in the past, but he got a couple of nerfs, and now the meta has shifted to make him really hard to play. Bo is moving from the D tier up into the C tier. He's another brawler that just did not get better, but there are so many other brawlers around him that got worse that he is at least a little playable competitively now. Eve is moving from the B tier down into the C tier. Eve is particularly good for countering brawlers that struggle to get past her hatchlings, but a lot of the top brawlers are able to deal with them just fine, so she's staying in the C tier for now. Willow is moving from the B tier down into the C tier. Willow actually got a small buff to her damage reduction while using her super, but it doesn't seem to have made much of a difference, and the other throwers in the game are just currently being used a lot more than her because they have hypercharges. Have you noticed a theme this year? To be clear, I actually really like hypercharges, but obviously the meta's a little bit weird and wonky for the moment. That's it for the C tier though. Now we have the B tier brawlers. These ones are competitive options. They may not be the best on every map, mode, or whatever, but with the right circumstance, they can be very competitive. Just not quite as overly competitive as the S and A tier. Next we have Penny, moving from the F tier all the way up into the B tier. Penny received a buff to her cannon health, which personally, I didn't think would make a huge difference for her, but apparently that small change made her go from being one of the worst brawlers in the game to at least average now. So that's pretty interesting. Lola is staying in the B tier. Lola received a slight buff to her attack damage, which hasn't really changed her interactions with too many other brawlers, so she's about where she was the last update. Leon is moving from the C tier up into the B tier. He didn't get any buffs, but there are just a couple brawlers that Leon plays really well against that are higher up in the meta right now, so he's an option. RT is moving from the A tier down to the B tier. RT was being used a lot because of how well he countered some of the strongest brawlers in the game last update, but now he's not being used as a counter pick quite as much because there are better options. Pam is starting out in the B tier. Nothing's really changed for Pam. She's still able to hold her own in this meta, so she's at least in the same spot as the last update. Pearl is moving from the C tier up into the B tier. She seems to be one of those few brawlers in the game that didn't get a balance change, but is significantly better this update just because she matches pretty well against some of the good brawlers in the game. Ruffs is staying in the B tier. Ruffs is kind of weak overall, but he's definitely still usable simply because he can make the best brawlers even better. Spike is staying in the B tier. He's actually slightly better now thanks to a buff to his health, but he's still really fragile, so it really hasn't affected how people are playing him, at least not competitively. Fang is staying in the B tier. He's actually getting countered pretty hard like most close range brawlers, but he still has actually pretty strong stats, so that makes him at least playable. Stu is staying in the B tier. He actually received a buff to his health, but despite being an assassin, his lack of damage is what has been slowly moving him down the tier list. Crow is moving from the A tier down into the B tier. Crow didn't actually get any worse, but most of the close range brawlers that he plays very well into just are not being used so much, so there's not really that much of a need for him unless somebody else chooses something and you want to counter them in ranked. 8-Bit is staying in the B tier. Nothing's really changed for 8-Bit this season, so he only is being used in certain maps and in certain matchups. Ems is staying in the B tier. Very similar to Crow, many of the brawlers that Ems counters just are not being played so much, so Ems really isn't that much either. Even though she is still a decent brawler, she is in the B tier. Sam is staying in the B tier. And honestly, he'd probably be a little bit further down the list if it weren't for the help from good support brawlers. Getting past the healing from teammates as well as his star power, even his biggest counters can struggle a little bit sometimes when he is healing himself thanks to his star power and he has teammates healing him as well. Buzz is moving from the A tier down into the B tier. Buzz is still a very strong assassin, but some of the biggest counters for him are at the top of the meta at the moment, so yeah, he's not getting played quite as much. Lou is staying in the B tier. He didn't receive any balance changes. He's being used just as much as he was the last update. Not much to talk about for him. Carl is moving from the C tier up into the B tier. Carl lovers rejoice. With a lot of close range assassins not being played quite as much, Carl's able to be played a little bit more now, even without getting any sort of buff. Belle is moving from the A tier down to the B tier. She's still a good brawler, but there are just way too many sharpshooters in the game that are better than her, so she just really isn't being played that much right now. Okay, Kenji. Let's talk about Kenji. We're putting him in the B tier. At the time of recording this video, Kenji has not been released, and most of the pros did not have a chance to be able to play him with the developer build like I did. And honestly, it's really hard to tell how good he's going to be. His damage seems to be pretty underwhelming, but his survivability with his trait, his star power, and his gadget might carry him. So he's just going to be right in the middle of the tier list for now. We'll have to see. Keep this placement with a very fat grain of salt. Sprout is staying in the B tier. Sprout got a buff to its attack damage, but it doesn't seem to have made much of a difference since Sprout still counters the same brawlers very well and gets countered very hard by the same brawlers as always. Nani is staying in the B tier. Now, Nani received a hypercharge this update, and while it did make her very slightly better than before, she's still not quite good enough to be one of the best brawlers in the game. Honestly, her hypercharge is not that great. Barry is moving from the S tier down into the B tier. Oh, thank goodness things have calmed down a little bit. Barry got a pretty significant nerf to his supercharging from his healing, and since that's the best way to charge his super, it has slowed him down a lot. Squeak is moving from the D tier up into the B tier. Squeak got his hypercharge this update, and it has made a huge difference for him, but he He was basically unplayable before, so now he's a little bit above average. Colette is moving from the A tier down into the B tier. Obviously, she is one of the best tank counters in the game, but tanks are not being played quite as much, and there are way more versatile options than Colette right now, even if you do need to counter some tanks. Gray is staying in the B tier. He's kind of a lot like Ruffs, where he doesn't deal a ton of damage, but his super can still create some really broken situations with the right comps, and so yeah, with the right brawlers, he's actually pretty good. Tara has moved from the C tier up into the B tier. Now she received her hypercharge and got some buffs to her star powers, and while they've definitely made her better, she still lacks the stats to be one of the best brawlers in the game at the moment. Griff is staying in the B tier. Griff has always been a great tank counter, and even against brawlers that outrange him, he can still be very useful depending on the map. In fact, I really like playing Griff a lot, but I'm not playing against pro players, so even though I want him to be higher on the tier list, we're not going to move him there because the pros said not to. Shelly is staying in the B tier. Shelly gets really carried by her clay pigeons gadget, so she's kind of inconsistent because as soon as she runs out of those, she's really not very good competitively at all. Poco is staying in the B tier. Poco actually received his hypercharge this update, and he's being used a little bit more because of it. But he's still only good with the right comp, and sometimes overhealing really doesn't even do anything for him. Otis is staying in the B tier. Otis has always been one of the best counters against assassins, and he has enough range to still be a good, safe choice against all other types of brawlers. But for now, there are still better options. Nita has moved from the A tier down into the B tier. Nita was a great brawler after she got her hypercharge, but now that tanks aren't feeding her super as much, she's only being played on a few maps at the moment. Melody has moved from the A tier down into the top of the B tier. She didn't receive any nerfs, but I'd say she's technically a close range brawler, even though her main attacks can cover a good distance. So this meta really just is not quite as good for her. Next up, we have the A tier brawlers. These brawlers are more competitive than the B tier options more frequently. They're almost always a good option, just not quite as good as the S tier brawlers. Starting off the A tier, we have Lily moving from the S tier down into the A tier. Lily was the best brawler in the game during my last tier list, and she had to get an emergency nerf. Aside from that, she is obviously a very close range brawler, so she's getting countered pretty hard right now, but she's still really good. Tick has moved from the B tier up into the A tier. Tick got a buff to his hypercharge rate, which helped him a little bit, but more importantly, the map pool right now usually favors throwers, so the good throwers have been used a little bit more. Dynamite is moving from the B tier up into the A tier. Dynamite is better now for similar reasons to Tick, and now that close range brawlers aren't being used quite as much, he doesn't have to be worried about being countered as frequently. Rico is staying in the A tier. Not much has changed for Rico since the last update, and he's still good on the same maps that he's always been good on. Jean is staying in the A tier. Jean's damage is actually kind of underwhelming for this meta, but his super still definitely makes him one of the better brawlers, and he doesn't get countered easily. Max is staying in the A tier. Max is also a really hard brawler to counter, mostly because of how fast she is, and her super is great to help support a lot of the best brawlers right now. Kit is moving from the S tier down into the A tier. Kit's cheeseburger gadget got nerfed, which was the main thing that made cheesy Kit comps so broken. These same comps are still very, very strong, but slightly less game breaking than before. Gus, wow, this is quite the jump. He's moved from the D tier all the way up into the A tier. Gus's attack damage got buffed, and it made a huge difference for him, mostly because any buff to his attack damage is also a buff to his gadget. Angelo is staying in the A tier. Angelo didn't get any balance changes, and they are one of the hardest brawlers in the game to counter, on top of being a great sharpshooter. Jessie is staying in the A tier. Jessie has some pretty average stats, but her hypercharged turret creates a big problem for the enemy and can outright just hard counter certain brawlers to the point where that alone makes her a really good brawler on most maps. Cordelius is staying in the A tier. Cordelius honestly does not have the best range, but his super is still one of the strongest abilities in the game, so I think that he's probably going to be A tier for a long time unless that gets changed somehow. Sandy's moving from the S tier down into the A tier. No changes were made to Sandy, and while he's still a very strong brawler, the meta just shifted a little bit so that he's no longer one of the best. Piper is staying in the A tier. She continues to be one of the best sharpshooters in the game, largely because she has abilities that help her deal with assassins, so she's actually really hard to counter, especially now that she has her hypercharge. Buster is staying in the A tier. He actually received a nerf to his health, but it doesn't seem to have changed up a lot of his 1v1 interactions against other brawlers, and his shield is still incredibly useful in any situation. Amber is staying in the A tier. Her Dancing Flames gadget got a damage nerf, but it's still a really strong gadget, and Amber is honestly just really easy to use in relation to how much damage she can deal, so she's still being played quite a bit. Clancy is staying in the A tier. Clancy actually received several nerfs this update, but surprisingly, he's still very similar to how he was before. It's a struggle for him to level up, but once he does, his super still instantly deletes anybody close to him, and he's fast enough to get any brawler inside of his attack range. Frank is moving from the S tier down into the A tier. Frank also received several nerfs, but he was the second best brawler in the game last update, so while he's not broken anymore, he's still very, very strong. Mandy's actually moving from the B tier up into the A tier. She received a buff to her hard candy star power, but interestingly, it's still not being used at all. She just coincidentally became a great brawler to use against the top brawlers in the game, and the map pool has also been in her favor. Byron is staying in the A tier. Byron remains the best healer or support brawler in the game, not only because of how well he keeps his teammates alive, but also because of how strong he is just by himself. He does a lot of damage. Barley is staying in the A tier. As I mentioned before, the current map pool really favors throwers, and a lot of the aggressive brawlers that counter them aren't being used, so Barley is being used quite a bit. Larry and Laurie are staying in the A tier at the top of the A tier. Along the same lines as Barley, the only thrower better than Barley is Larry and Laurie. They still don't have their hypercharge, but Larry is still the strongest thrower in the game, even after so many nerfs in the past. But now what you've been waiting for, the S tier, the best brawlers in the game. They're almost always competitive, and they do a big job at shaping the entire meta. Kicking us off, we have Surge moving from the B tier up into the S tier. Now, Surge got his hypercharge this update, and this has made a huge difference for him. He still struggles a bit to land those first few shots, but once he levels up and starts charging his supers, his hypercharge has made him more unstoppable than he was before. Chester is actually moving from the A tier up into the S tier. Chester's damage output is just insane, so you can't play close range brawlers against him, and he has enough range to still make him a really safe choice on about any map. Meg is staying in the S tier. Her attack damage actually got nerfed, but she's still dealing an insane amount of damage with an attack that's already very easy to land. On top of that, you basically have to kill her twice, so she has some of the best survivability in the game. Mortis, oh, this is a big jump, from the D tier all the way up into the S tier. Mortis definitely got the strongest hypercharge in this update, and it is currently the strongest hypercharge in the game. He honestly still gets countered pretty hard by his usual counters, but just one hypercharge from him can easily wipe a team and change the whole match. Gale is actually moving from the A tier up into the S tier. Now, technically, Gale actually got nerfed, but they fixed a bug that made him quite a bit stronger, so he's not quite as strong as before. That being said, he also has one of the strongest hypercharges in the game, and he is playing into this meta very well. Oh, this is a big jump. Daryl is moving from the F tier all the way up to being the second best brawler in the game. Daryl got a rework, which I'm going to just call a buff, since it took him from the F tier all the way up into the S tier, and basically they just gave him 2 supers. That one added super to every supercharge has easily made him the best close range brawler in the game, and it's to the point where other close range brawlers are useless because he's just so good. But the best brawler in the game right now is Mo. Now, this is Mo's first update in the game, and he's another brawler that was just way too strong on release. Keep in mind that since discussing things with the pro players, Mo actually did get a nerf. They made it so that he no longer retains the ammo that he had when he uses his super. So he may not be the #1 brawler right now, but I think it's a pretty safe bet that he's still S tier. His attacks deal tons of damage, and it's very hard to avoid his super. Honestly, his super is probably the strongest in the game now, and even though he did get one small tweak to him, I am fully expecting some more nerfs. He's really good. And there you have it, the Brawl Stars competitive tier list. If you share it with anybody, make sure you don't crop out my face. And a huge thank you to all of the pro players who helped put this together. Also to each of them, massive good luck in the World Championship. And for everybody that didn't respond to my DMs, well, good luck to you guys too, just not quite as much. Let me know in the comment section below what you liked about this update, as well as what balance changes or other reworks you hope to see in the future. Subscribe for more, and we'll see you in the next video.